So Barry, a couple episodes ago, we announced this partnership that we're doing starting this year with this really great company, AEP Connections. And I see that we've added quite a few listeners since then. So do you want to give us a little bit of a refresher here, give our listeners a refresher on AEP Connections, who they are, and why we're partnering with them?
Yes, AEP Connections hosts live webinars. I've actually done some work with them, and it's always high-quality topics in neurodiversity. But they're building a library of on-demand courses now. And this summer, they're focusing on providing you with fantastic content at your fingertips. They have courses designed specifically for on-demand with many speakers on many important topics. However, many of their live presentations from this spring are also being made available for on-demand, so you can access them now. If you aren't able to see the courses live, be sure to check them out over the summer. Also, if you need approved provider hours, and it's really important for things such as licensure, they offer many, so be sure to check out the different courses and see the approvals from so many professional agencies.
Absolutely. I know, from Kristen's point of view, I always was hearing about, I'm as an SLP, I need more hours. I need more, professional development. And it's great. It's good to be on top of your craft in that way. So if anybody's looking for some discounts on professional development, AEP Connections, they actually have a few options. So they've got bundled packages, which will, save you money, but also by being a friend of Uniquely Human, the podcast, and AEP Connections, they are extending an additional discount code. So you can save an additional 10% on this offering just by entering the promo code UH10. That's UH10 in your checkout cart. Any topics that we should be aware of, Barry, that you're doing, for instance, that I should be signing up for?
Sure, yeah. And then we're talking about Gestalt language processing. We talk about neurodiversity and issues related to that, but there are many other speakers as well. And it's a real cool perk that you get the 10% discount if you put UH10 or UH10 in your checkout cart. Check them out.
Awesome. The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. So today on Uniquely Human, the podcast, we are very excited to have Dr. Destiny Huff with us. And I'll tell you in a minute why I'm so excited. But welcome, Destiny.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and it really is our pleasure. So just a little bit of a background. Actually, it's not too much in the past history. But you and I were both on Ross Green's Lives in the Balance Summit a few weeks ago. And so I stayed on, which I don't always do, to listen to you. And I was blown away. And I am not exaggerating. The topic is so near and dear to my heart. And you were so succinct, clear, helpful, and obviously so knowledgeable on a very deep level. So let me just share with our listeners who you are, and then we're going to have some exciting discussions here. Dr. Destiny Huff is a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD mental health professional and a non-attorney special education advocate. She also is the mother of two neurodivergent learners, both on IEPs, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about IEPs. Uh, she has been in the mental health field for over 15 years as a licensed professional counselor who has worked in early childhood, elementary, middle, and high school settings. And that resonated with me because my consulting covers that breadth of experience. She
Nice.
also has worked as a reintegration case manager for youth in foster care and as a case manager and supervisor for individuals with severe mental health diagnoses and disabilities. She works side by side with early childhood educators, primary and secondary educators, trainers, instructional coaches, and administrators, and was able to see firsthand what is needed for neurodivergent learners in their educational settings and what types of trainings and supports are necessary for staff to support neurodivergent children's mental health in a variety of settings, which is such an important issue. So, Destiny, tell us a little bit about your background and your personal journey, and you obviously have a number of priorities in your work, but how did you get to focusing on advocating for and supporting families?
Yeah, so every time I hear my own bio, I'm like, man, that's an impressive person. Did I really do all those things? Because it's just I've been doing it for so long. So, yeah, so how it started was I actually wanted to be an educator. My mother and sister are both educators,
Mhm.
and I'm the oldest. And my mother was like, "You will not be an educator." So I was talking to someone a few weeks ago that was like, she knew your strengths because she was just like, no, I don't think that's for you. I was like, okay. So I took a psych class in high school and I was like, oh, I love psychology. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to be a therapist.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think back to that autism that was not diagnosed at the time, and just thinking about how I was like, this is it now. This is what I'm gonna do. And so I went on, became a therapist. I always wanted to work with children.
Mhm.
So I got certified as a trauma therapist for children as well. And I've worked in the CACs, so the Children Advocacy Centers, for children specifically who have experienced abuse and neglect. I think that was the first time I really got an in-depth understanding of trauma.
Mhm.
And I think all things kind of set you up for the future, whether you know it or not, good, bad, or indifferent. That's kind of a lesson my mom taught me. And so as I went on, then later on, I got married. My husband's in the military. He was active duty. He's currently reserved now. And our child entered into the public school system in the state of
Mhm.
Louisiana. And we'd always seen black or white thinking, perfectionism, things like that. But he got in the public school system and we just were at a loss. I had worked in the schools. My sister was an educator. My mom was an educator. I had friends that were educators. So they were giving me all this feedback. And they were telling me like they're not doing right by your child. And
Mhm.
so then that's when I was like, okay, his teacher, and I tell everyone this, was phenomenal. She really worked with us. And then at one point, I think they honestly made her feel like her job was in jeopardy. So we lost communication for a little bit. But what led me to becoming an advocate from that was that he was suspended 3 times in 2 weeks.
Huh.
And we came back from break, and it was essentially like I tell all parents now, there's kind of this thought process, right? You've been through the first year of schooling or the first half of schooling, you know the rules now. So you should be doing what you're supposed to do. That's the
Mhm.
thought process, right? So
Right.
it's like, oh, you're still not doing what you're supposed to do. So we're going to punish you. And that doesn't work for children with disabilities.
Mhm.
And so I sought out a Black clinical and educational psychologist. So if you haven't seen my picture, I am Black. My son is Black as well.
Mhm.
And we were in a predominantly white area. And so he got his official diagnosis of autism. And my husband had to go to the superintendent, and we finally got an IEP.
Mhm.
So I always tell everyone as a mental health professional, I know that we could have all been diagnosed with PTSD from the impact of that situation.
Oh my goodness.
And so that's how I became an advocate, because I was like, no family should go through that. And then during that process, me and my son are two sides of the same coin. So I have two sons. One's autistic and one's ADHD with a speech delay. And so for my autistic son, I was like, hey, I see me. And in my ADHD son, I was like, hey, I see me. And so I sought out a competent mental health professional that had worked with females in particular that are neurodivergent. And I was formally diagnosed as autistic and ADHD. So I got diagnosed in my 30s. So that's, a quick, fast, kind of long-winded way of getting to how I got from where I was to where I am now.
but very efficient. I mean, it just struck me, for you being a mom and wearing that hat, because we're going to talk about different hats, um, how painful that must have been to have your son being blamed, and being punished because he was being blamed for an unrecognized neurodevelopmental difference.
Yes. It was incredibly disheartening to start off because I think as parents, we have a perception of our child. And I'm very big on, I'm not that parent that thinks my child can do no wrong. I mean, people are people and people are flawed. But just to hear some of the ways in which they were referring to my child. So I had always worked during both of my children's entire lives. So they went into what I like to call a structured setting, so childcare, when they were 6 weeks old. And so the way they were talking about my child was like this child that had never been in a structured setting, that didn't know boundaries or rules. And I was just like, this is not my child. And I think the part that was most disheartening for me was when we would step in the room, I'm the only one here that's a mental health professional.
Mm-hmm.
And you're telling me that my child is oppositional defiant.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm the only one in here with the credentials to diagnose. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one in here with the credentials, that's had to be trained on the DSM. So, and for people listening, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and that is what you're trained on in mental health to diagnose individuals. So it was just very disheartening to hear this picture of this child that they were giving me versus what I knew my child and what many educators before them had described my child as. And so I think that I got so flooded that I couldn't discern between it because it puts you in that fight or flight state where you're trying to just figure out how to give a solution. And that was the other side, was they looked at me as a professional. And so they were like, well, you work with kids and you've worked with kids like your son, so fix it.
And here we get into the intersectionality issues here and what they're, who is the Dr. Destiny Huff that I'm talking with now? Is it a mom? Is it a mental health professional? You should know better. The blame and the shame comes in, which we're going to do a deeper dive into because that's such an important part of the work that you do and that you teach people about. Oh my goodness, I guess I don't have to ask you. I have my little questions here. How your personal experiences have informed your professional activities.
I know, it's so interconnected for me that it's like half the time I get questions and then they're like, oh, well, I think you answered this one.
It might be easier to address, are there any ways that it hasn't informed your work?
That's right. That's right. And then, going beyond your experiences as parents and a mental health counselor, your experiences of having all these family members who have navigated, worked in the educational system, and they know the ins and outs of that. So you have this intergenerational influence on you. It's in your DNA. Yeah, you know it. Absolutely. So you make a distinction. I'm just thinking about all the things I learned from you a few weeks ago. You make a distinction between a parent and then a professional parent. Okay. And that can be confusing in a sense when you interface with the educational system, because, depending upon the role that you're playing, you have to make some decisions. And especially the different ways that people may relate to you because of your different roles. So tell us a little bit more about that, the parent versus the professional parent, and how that makes things extra complicated.
Yeah, so when I started my advocacy journey, my thought process, of course, was just like helping families that have learners that are considered, maybe behavior issues or that are autistic or speech delays and things like that, because that's what I'm familiar with my own children. And when I was finding that, I was getting a lot of what I call professional parents, which are parents that are educators, nurses, administrators. They work in some capacity with the school setting. And what they were coming to me about was that they were that parent that understood, because I'm in the system. I know the system's flawed. I know the system's broken. And so they were very understanding. And so they were like, I get it. Oh, there's this behavior issue. I get it because I deal with that myself with my students, or I get it because I see that in my work, and so like, oh, the timelines. Yeah, parents want everything right away. I get it. Like, you guys are backed up, you have this or that, right? So they have that, what I call professional parent hat on, which is like, I'm a professional, so I understand your stress, your strain, the pressure. I get it. But then when they were able to separate from that, right? So I go home and I look at an email or a letter home or a progress report, or I'm getting a phone call or a text message. It's about my child, and I feel like my child's needs are not being met. And I'm getting frustrated because now I'm having to balance what I'm supposed to understand, what I've professionally been taught, and still advocate for, and I like to call them the tiny humans. No matter how old they get, they're always our tiny humans.
Tiny humans. Tiny, uniquely humans.
Yes. And so I was getting a lot of that, and they were coming to me genuinely like, Dr. Huff, what do I do here? Right? Because now I'm balancing like a lot. Sometimes it was their own district, and they're like, I don't know how to approach this or tackle this. And so, that's where I make that distinction, and that's what I've come across. And so for me, my issue wasn't that I was in that district at the time, because I was actually supporting early childhood learners at the time, when everything was going on with my son. Where they were pulling at me from the professional parent side was that I was a mental health professional who did work with children, who did help educators with behaviors and dysregulation. And so they were like, you should know how to address this. And I had to take a step back and go, because this is right during COVID time. So this is when we're allowed to come in the buildings again, but still like you wear your mask and you don't, just to be clear, to set up so there wasn't observations. You're not going into the classroom observing your child. Okay. So I had to put myself in that position of, I'm not physically in there. I only know what you tell me, and I can try and work with that. But at the end of the day, emotionally, I'm still his mom.
Yep. I can relate to this. So, I mean, I'm not a professional in any sense of the word, but what I will say is, I can usually remain objective about things until my kids get involved. And then for some reason, all objectivity just goes out the window. And the stakes are so high, especially when you're not there to see it for yourself. That must have been such a just a powerless feeling, I think. And I think when parents feel powerless, that's when you start to get the emotions running hot, understandably.
And I always point out too, I just want to tack on to that whenever parents are reached out to problem solve, it is almost always when we have already been dysregulated. And what I mean by that is, if you're calling me and you're like, Destiny is doing X, Y, and Z, and so we'd like for you to come up to the school so we could talk about this. Okay, all right, I'll get there. I have no ability to problem solve. I have no ability to talk through a solution with you. None of that. And so I think that's when, as parents, we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Yes. Because we are very much dysregulated, and we either want to appease you because we do want this to stop, right? Or we get really offended and like defensive, you know what I mean? Or we freeze up and we don't have anything to say because we don't know what to say. So I think there's all these levels to it. And they are like, this is what I do, right? Because I deal with this on a regular basis. And so they're calling you and they're following their playbook, but we don't have a playbook.
Yeah. It's I find that even some of the best professionals who know that when you're working with a student who's highly dysregulated, you can't talk a lot to them, you can't expect them to process, doesn't necessarily translate into interacting with parents. It's and then the other thing is that I think that parent professionals, when educational staff interact with them and they know they're in some kind of related field, service field, that you can just turn on and turn off your emotional reaction. That, okay, if you're a nurse, you're a special educator, you're a psychologist, that you are going to be spoken to, and Of course, you know this stuff. You're a professional. And as you said, so clearly, but you're coming from a very, very different place at that time. You're coming from a different part of your brain at that time.
Yeah. And it's, as my wife always says, the calmest energy in the room dominates in the end. Maybe not in the moment, but in the end, overall big picture, if you're the calmest in the room, your agenda is advancing, more likely than anybody else's. The trick is for parents who are, like you said, dysregulated, feeling powerless, feeling like they can't control a situation, coming into that. So there's an expression, and pardon the colorful language on it. It's not my expression, but the expression is, it's illegal. It's not illegal to be an asshole, but unfortunately it is illegal to punch one. So
I'm sorry, I love that, because that's correct.
That is the universal problem. If we could go around punching our provokers, then maybe things would be better. I don't know, like old West times. But what I will say is that for parents, it's the hardest job, because you could be sitting across from a professional or a team of professionals, lawyers, educators, whoever else. Your lawyer's not there, right? Theirs is, who are either working in really good faith, but you're not getting anywhere and you feel frustrated, or you could be sitting across from a completely dismissive panel of subject matter experts who are dismissing you, being snarky, being, condescending. And if you start to react hot, then you become that parent who's just difficult to work with. And it's this ridiculous double standard that parents have to navigate and thread these needles in. And it's not easy, but it's so vitally important to stay regulated when you're on that other side of it.
Yeah. And if the educational staff feel all they need to say is, you shouldn't get upset, going back to Seinfeld here. Serenity now.
Right.
That doesn't quite work. I have to say something. I have to just jump in and say, there are some wonderful administrators and educators as well.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sure Destiny could pick them out like radar, as opposed to some of the much more challenging circumstances. But unfortunately, so many of the challenging circumstances should not have to be that way. So that actually leads me to the next issue I wanted to bring up. You are so deeply experienced with your kids and then with many other children. What are some of the mistakes that you see professionals making? And sometimes, and you pointed this out in your presentation in the Lives in the Balance Summit, sometimes they're unintentional. It's not like they're bad people. I think you believe, like I believe, if you're going into education, especially with kids with different disabilities, it's likely you're not a bad person.
Right.
But you screw up a lot. So what interferes with the development of trusting relationships that you observe often? What rises to the top for you?
I think one of the big things that rises to the top for me is just validation. I think that sometimes ego and pride get in the way of validating a parent's fear or concern. I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with one of my clients and they're just like, they just don't hear me. They just don't get it. They just this and that. And I get in the room, and just because I have doctor in front of my name, they are way more sitting up in their chair and open and responsive and listening to what I'm saying. And I'm like, it shouldn't take that. And so I think that sometimes there's just a lack of understanding at how far you can go by just simply saying, I hear you, Miss Huff. I see that you're frustrated. I see that you want to address this. I see this is bothering you too. Because part of that shame that we have is that we want them to know that we take this just as seriously as you do. But we're not there. We're not in the classroom with them. And so we're trying to do what we can on our end. And I think sometimes it can come off from professionals, right? Or, like school staff, it can come off as if you don't understand what we're dealing with or care. And the parent's like, you're going to hold this meeting and you're not going to think about my child until you step back in this building at 8:30 in the morning. I'm going to think about this issue until we say it's resolved.
That actually brings up a related issue here. And that is when educators, and under this category of possible mistakes, might even sugarcoat everything and talk about the fact that, oh, everything's going really well, no problems, no problems. And a parent knows, I don't think so.
Yeah.
How about a little bit of honesty here? Do you run into that?
Yes, and I love that you said it like that because it's funny because I always say my kids are very different. They need two very different approaches and styles. They need two very different types of teachers. So whenever I feel like someone is not a good fit for them, I make it very clear, like I'm not bashing anyone. Like my kids just need two very different approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you're speaking to, I have that conversation a lot with like my sister, for example, because she tells me like we're taught to be more she's a second grade teacher, and she was like, we are kind of taught to not always, it's kind of framed to them as discuss the negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what can happen is you end up not saying quote unquote any of the negative. And because you're told that's not a big deal, that's a thing you need to deal with. And I'm like, which may not be wrong, right? Sometimes we know it's a classroom management issue. You know what I mean? Like sometimes we know it's an approach issue. But what I tell all of my kids' teachers is, I want to know
Yes.
if it's something we've identified that we are working on, if it's something that's a concern, I want to know. And going back to when I said my kids are two different kids, one of my kids, he's going to tell me. So they'll be like, Miss Huff, you had a great day. Da, 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 da. And they'll be like, well, I had a little bit of a hiccup. And his hiccup is something that it's just like, he got upset. He stomped his foot. He took a moment. He got, you know what I mean? It's not even a
Mm-hmm.
big thing. But for him, and I always like to point that back out to the staff too, to him, that was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he feels like it was a big thing, right? So
Yes.
go ahead.
What is the clinical word? Catastrophizing? Where
Yes,
you're just
yes,
like,
that
oh
is.
my God,
Yes.
they're all going to think I'm a spaz. And I do this 30 times a day. And my wife always has to remind me, nobody's thinking about you ever.
I think about you, Dave.
I'll let her know. Thank you, Barry. It's nice that I've got somebody looking at. But you're so right. It feels huge. And so the truth is in there in the middle, but it's good to have both perspectives of the teacher saying like, yeah, I didn't notice anything and wasn't disruptive to the classroom. And so you can even feed that back to your child and say like, it feels big to you, and then vice versa. I'm not sure if you're aware that what you said to that other kid on the playground, like during recess time, I don't think you understand that was actually hurtful to them. You didn't mean it to be. But this is why we're having the discussion. But I see what you mean about almost being conditioned not to sit there and harp on the negative. But educators are in the role to grow the individuals into adults along with the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And while as Barry always says, the teachers, the educators, the professionals, they're the ones who are experts in the approaches and the classroom management. The parents are the experts in their child, and so the truth is sort of in the middle.
And it's
I think I had a mentor in mental health who always said the day that I don't need to learn anymore, that I say I've learned everything, I need to retire from the field. And I feel I've taken that with me. And she told me that like my first, I call it big girl job, out of grad school. And I've taken that with me throughout my career because we're always learning. I'm not sure how long the podcast has been on, but it's like 10, 15 years ago, like you wouldn't see a podcast like this. And that's my point, is that we're always growing and we're always learning, but you have to be open to listening. And I think sometimes, especially school settings, the dynamic is set up where this is how we do things and this is how we do things. And I always tell the teams, like, it takes one person to go, I think we can do this a little differently, to start getting everyone else wrapped around that, thought process and that way of thinking.
So many points that you've raised are triggering my mind's kind of exploding. I don't know which one to go to here. But close to the beginning of my career, I worked for 10 years and developed a speech language pathology department in a children's psychiatric hospital. That was part of the Brown School of Medicine. And the whole complications of the interface between mental health systems and educational systems, and the kinds of supports as well as misunderstandings that happened there. So that's one point I'm going to ask you to follow up on. So write it down because I have a second one. and the second point is that you raised is, if a teacher or an educator or educational therapist, related service personnel, don't connect with a child, it's not necessarily that you're a bad professional or that the kid's a bad kid. And I remember one of the luxuries when I worked in the psychiatric hospital, which included both day programs, which were like special ed programs, and then inpatient programs. What was put right up front is if you are not connecting with a child on your caseload, then maybe it's better for somebody else to work with that child or consult to that child. Mm-hmm. And it's seen at a professional level. It's the height of professionalism. It's not blaming, oh, that kid drives me crazy, he never cooperates with me, such a bad kid, or you know what I'm talking about. So take it from there, Destiny.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that is always the most interesting thing that I see when I sit at IEP tables for IEP meetings, and I'm virtual. I do all those virtual. I only do my own children's in person because I support all over the US. I can't tell you how many times related service providers, like specifically speech and OT, how they have such unique insights on the child. Because a lot of times they're doing small group with them, they're one-on-one with them. So they're seeing their sensory needs. Mm-hmm. They're seeing that movement works for them, singing works for them. They're seeing all these things, and how the meeting is the first time. A lot of times the educators are hearing about this. Like they're like, oh, that works for me. And I'm just like, ooh, look, that's why you're having quote unquote behavior issues and they're not. Maybe, I'm just throwing it out there. But it's interesting because I think as soon as you said mental health and educational, the first thing that came to my mind is that we're both overworked and we're both underpaid and we're all tired.
Yes.
And so, but it's very funny because like we've kind of been placed with special education in particular, I feel. We've been placed on this same plane, right? Where we need each other in order to support children in special education.
Oh, yeah.
Mental health professionals bring that diagnostic criteria, but we also bring this approach where we have, do no harm. And, we have to facilitate a connection. Like literally one of the first goals you ever write for a treatment plan has to be like, we are going to facilitate a relationship, or, like you're building this relationship. Mental health professionals, this is what we have to do. Mm-hmm. And then in education, they are teaching them. And as Dave said, that you say, Barry, all the time, is like they're building them for the future as adults, and they're teaching them, they're educating them, giving them these life skills. And so when it comes to our disabled learners, we need both of those things. And what I find is we end up clashing because ego is in the room. Mm-hmm. And I always say it's not about you, it's about the child. Mm-hmm. And so when you can put the child in front and you can look at what the child needs and you can look at what benefits the child, then you can work together.
Yes. And oh man, it's about what we're here to do, not about you. And that applies in an IEP meeting the same way it applies in a sales meeting. It's check your egos at the door. Let's remember why we're all here. Yes.
A concrete strategy, and I wanted to talk a little bit about advice that you give around the IEP process, Destiny. But, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I heard this a long time ago from a mom. Whenever I go to an IEP meeting, I bring a framed 5x7 photograph of my child and I put it down in the middle of the table.
I have heard that, yes.
So that if the discussion kind of gets waylaid down different rabbit holes and the egos start building, or people start getting a little frazzled, you could just point.
Yes, I have heard that. I have. Yes.
Yeah. So what kinds of advice do you give to parents? Because the IEP, I mean, for so many of our listeners who are parents or people who've gone through it or who are students or were students, you know how emotionally charged that could be.
Yeah, and you guys are getting me fresh today. My son's IEP meeting, one of my son's IEP meetings was this morning.
Whoa,
And
whoa.
so
How did it go?
and it went really well. But it was scheduled previously for other days, and then they had stuff come up because here in Georgia, they're out of school on the 21st. So we're coming up pretty fast. But yeah, so one of the things that I always say is bring support.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of parents get really caught in the weeds about what that means. They get caught up in like, oh, I'm hiring an advocate. I don't have money for it. No, just bring support. Excuse me, like anyone that you can lean on, sit next to. For me, early on, that became my husband.
Mm-hmm.
And him being military, that was a challenge. But I was always like, I need you at these meetings. And so it just became understood that like we will schedule this around his schedule so that he can be there, because him being an officer, he has that mentality of like, we're gonna rein it in.
Yes.
And so when I get emotional and I start getting in the weeds because I'm just like, I just want you to understand. He's like, what me and my wife would like to see happen.
Yeah. I mean, if you could bring a military officer to every IEP meeting, oh, what a different world we would live in. We should just hire out your husband, but please continue.
It's so funny. But his demeanor, though, now that you say that, his demeanor is so different now that I'm an advocate, because he's more relaxed, because he's like, she knows the law side of it, right? She knows what you all are supposed to be doing. So I can just be here as her support, versus he used to have to kind of come in as that level-headed, like, let's redirect this, get this back on track. Everyone get on the same page to listen. Now he comes in more as, I'm dad, and I just want you all to know I am involved. I am aware of the ins and outs of their education, and I'm a part of this process. So it's very interesting for me. Like I saw today a huge shift from where we were 3 years ago when we were dealing with everything, and he was coming in the meeting like uniform on, like, you're going to listen to what my wife and I have to say.
And I promise you there are people listening to this, there are moms listening to this, dads listening to this, who are saying like, God, I wish we were that aligned, because so many times the parents diverge right in the meeting. And it's unavoidable sometimes.
Yeah. And I've had to speak on that. I've had families where I've had to just like send that email and say, look, before the meeting, I need you and dad to sit down and talk. And I give them questions. And then we meet. And then we can come back together, because I'm like, you have to be united in this meeting. Because they don't need a reason to think they can sway one over the other. And that's not a bad, and I want to be clear, that is nothing against the school. Everyone, I think, in my opinion, comes in there thinking they are doing the right thing. The question is, what is the right thing for the child?
That's right. And that gets to the issue of kind of what I refer to as that very, very fine, fluid line between parents being appropriately assertive as opposed to being perceived as, it's a term I hate, especially when used to with kids, but sometimes parents as well, aggressive. And I'll tell just a very quick story. You're talking about the different roles a few years ago. It wasn't an IEP meeting, but I was consulting, so it was like a progress report meeting. And the parents came in, and the team was there. And the dad, who was a police officer, came in and he said, before we get started, I want to say one thing. If you say anything that is disrespectful or negative about my child, we are out of here. We are out of here in a flash. And it relates to what you said earlier, what I like to refer to as pathologizing language. just talking in negative terms. Oh, his behavior is this and then, yeah. So I threw a few things out there, but maybe we could come back to the assertiveness versus, you know, I think parents want to have those trustworthy relationships, but they are again working from their, sorry for the strange term here, emotional brain,
Yeah.
from their
Yeah.
instincts, their parental instincts. This is my love of my life.
I'm very protective. Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to touch on that and the pathologizing and the negative. So starting with the assertive and aggressive. I mean, I'm a Black woman. And so I am often perceived as aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something I think now that I'm almost approaching 40 that I no longer care about. I used to care about it a lot. Now I think I have gotten to a place of I feel like I have, which is not necessary for everyone, but I feel like I have the experience and the credentials to back it up.
Yes.
And so I have now gotten to a place of if you perceive it that way, that's your perception. That is not my intent.
Mm-hmm.
Now on the opposite side of that, my husband is 5'10" and he's built like a football player. He's also Black. Our sons are boys and they are Black.
Mm-hmm.
So aggressive is a term that really resonates with me from that regard
Mm-hmm.
because it's used too often and too flippantly. And so I have often talked to a lot of parents because I support parents of all races and ethnicities, and they come to me and the first thing they say is like, I don't want to be perceived as an angry Black woman when I'm just trying to support my child.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to do that. And I tell them, you let me step in the room and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that to me is often that very small-minded way of forcing you to not advocate.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. It already puts you at a status alert where it's like, okay, we're not on even playing ground right now.
Right.
Absolutely. It automatically shakes you. And if that's a term that's been associated with you, it takes you back to those places. And now you are not on even footing. And
Nope.
so that's what you're worried about now is everything I speak. Am I sounding that way? Am I coming off that way?
That's right.
Versus being able to come in there and fully advocate for your child. And so that's the other reason why I tell parents to always write it down. Any requests you have, any concern you have, you send that to them in writing beforehand so that regardless of what may come out of my mouth in that meeting, you have it in black and white on paper in a quote unquote professional way of what my concerns are and what I want for my child.
Mm-hmm. As you well know, there's so much discussion now about neurodivergent people for the benefit of their own mental health, being their authentic selves. And it does raise a question about parents and moms, especially being able to be their authentic self. And I don't experience that directly, but kind of growing up as a street kid in Brooklyn, very often my authentic self is perceived as a little bit too direct and too rude, and I have to change register and code in some situations. But again, if you're reacting based upon your instincts, your protective instincts for your child, and you happen to be a woman of color, and especially a Black woman, right away so many people go to that. But you're doing what you need to do, what both your mind and your gut instinct tells you to do. And oh, what a conundrum that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just on that negative language and pathologizing piece, as an advocate, when I step into a meeting, if I don't hear that, I'm like, that's great. That's awesome. But I'm not against hearing it. And I'm going to tell you why. Because I want to honestly know your perception of this learner.
Yes.
And sometimes that can scare them from saying their honest perception.
Yes.
And it doesn't facilitate those larger conversations about their perception. A lot of things that are labeled as behavior are executive functioning.
Yes.
A lot of things that are labeled as behavior concerns require executive and sensory functioning supports. So I like to step in a meeting and I like for you to say, they're just always getting up out of their seat every time in the middle of math. And then
Yes.
when I ask them to go sit down, they go sit down, but I have to ask them like 5 or 6 times. And I'm like, okay, so we're talking about an ADHD learner.
Yes.
They require movement. They do a lot of fidgeting. You notice he's only doing it during math time. So walk me through, is this all math? Is it? And then they start turning their wheels and they're like, well, it's ever since we started word problems. Okay. We know there's a little struggle with reading.
Hmm.
So now he's adding that to math, which he used to love, but now it's becoming something that is more complicated and he's struggling. What executive functioning tools are we using? Oh, well, we haven't tried. Well, maybe. Then here comes OT, right? And OT is like, well, they like alternate seating in my class. Like they use this and that. Okay, so alternate seating. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Fidget tools. Do we maybe need breaks? Oh, we
Yes.
could try that. You see what I mean? It causes this bigger conversation, but no one is being accused of anything. And that is the nuance that
Hmm.
I often mitigate between the professional and the parent. Because there's times where the parent can accuse the professional, since I'm on the
Yes.
school staff, and the school staff can accuse the parent. And I have to kind of jump in and be like, okay,
Hmm.
let's redirect it back because you're both passionate about what you're talking about and you both really care about what you're providing for this learner. That doesn't mean that's what the learner needs.
Yes. And I think one strategy that helps, this comes out of our CERTS educational model, is let's not talk about behaviors. Let's talk about dysregulation. Let's
Ding, ding,
focus
ding.
on the underlying cause. And many people have said this for many years. Just don't look at the tip of the iceberg and just don't label it away by saying, oh, that's an attention seeking behavior. Oh,
Oh,
that's an escape motivated behavior.
I hate
I mean,
attention seeking so
why
bad.
is the kid trying to escape? Why don't we talk about that?
Right.
And when they say attention seeking, I'm always quick to go, they're like, well, they're seeking attention from their peers. I'm like, so they're trying to connect with their peers.
That's right.
And they're like, oh,
I think attention seeking has become this huge kind of garbage category of almost anything that a child does that's undesirable was attention seeking.
mhm, agreed.
Yeah.
My friend Lisa Baskin-Wright always says, get curious. And I'm like, that is right there. There you
Be-
go.
Beautifully stated. Be curious. Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm curious about the fact that we could probably go on another hour, but we can't go on another hour. I feel funny kind of saying, so Destiny, any last thoughts?
as we're just getting started.
I know there's so many gems we have not mined yet. But any takeaways for our parents, our listeners, our professional listeners, our neurodivergent listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think for, staff or school staff, professionals, educators, get curious, ask why. That's the biggest question we don't ask is why is it happening? And that
Hmm.
sometimes does involve asking the learner why they did what they did.
Hmm.
So don't assume that you know. For my parents, I think find your community. That is so important to find people that understand what you're going through and that you can collaborate with and won't feel judged when you're talking about the stress. And I'm neurodivergent, and sometimes my children do things, and I'm just like, because of how I was raised and how society says things are supposed to go. And I have to take a step back and remember I'm parenting my children for their future, not
Hmm.
anyone else's. And I mean that in the sense of that I want them to be emotionally safe and healthy in the future. And so that's the dynamic me and my husband are creating. And you can either be a part of that or not. And then for neurodivergence, take a break. Like people don't realize that we are everywhere. We're in all fields. Um, and so we often mask to the point of burnout. And so take a break, take a moment, and give space for the parents of neurodivergence because they don't always know what their child is dealing with. But many of them are trying to learn. And in order for them to learn, we have to give them the space to feel comfortable to ask the questions.
Mm-hmm. So important. Thank you, Destiny.
Thank you for having me.
ありがとうございました。Shota Ishikawa, Tatsuhiko Takeda. 私の名前は Matt Savage です。